On Friday, when I was writing this sermon, the temperature stayed below freezing all day. Yesterday, we awoke to a wintry mix of ice and snow. Days to stay home and try to stay warm. Here on the edge of winter solstice, with sunrise after 7 a.m. and sunset before 5 p.m., it can sometimes be hard to remember that the wheel of the year, it will continue to turn. And the time is coming again a few months from now when sunrise will be before 6 a.m. and it will last until almost 9 p.m. During these current days of barely 9.5 hours of sunlight, it can be hard to remember that there will be a time 6 months from now with nearly 15 hours of daylight each day. This year, winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year, will arrive on Wednesday, the 21st. These days around winter solstice are an auspicious time to consider the spirituality of winter and darkness, of night and shadow. What might these archetypes have to teach us during this season of our lives? We live in an age in which there is an almost constant temptation to distraction, to fixate on spectacle over substance, instead of taking the risk of looking within, as Julia was talking about, or connecting with the people around us. There's the lure of smartphones and the internet, the diversions of fake news and celebrity culture. But the cold, dark days of winter beckon us to slow down and to risk looking within. And one of the most fruitful practices of a spirituality of darkness, night, and winter is what is sometimes called shadow work. Our ego is the part of ourself that we are all quite aware of. The shadow is those parts of ourself which remain unconscious, but still nonetheless affect us. From the Christian tradition of my childhood, one of the most well-known examples of this is a passage from Paul's letter to the church in Rome, in which he confesses, "I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, yet I do the very thing that I hate." We're in the middle of December, the 12th and final month of the year. So if you think back to January, this past January or previous Januaries, maybe you set a New Year's resolution. Are you still with that here in December, with all of them? Maybe some of you are. Are you still exercising daily, sticking to that diet, committed to a daily spiritual practice, or whatever the resolution was for you? As I suspect many of you, including myself, can testify, setting a conscious intention is an important first step to keeping a resolution, but it is no guarantee of long-term success. And part of what often undermines our conscious intention is the part of ourself that remains unconscious. Regarding the importance of shadow work for spiritual growth, for psychological maturity, the psychologist Carl Jung said that one does not become enlightened by sitting around imagining figures of light. One becomes enlightened by making the darkness conscious. And our invitation is to become more conscious of what is currently unconscious within ourselves. And the promise of shadow work is that as we become more aware of our own complexity, we become actually more interesting to ourselves. Even more importantly, we become less dangerous to ourselves and to others. Consider these real-life examples of the shadow at play, with the names changed to protect the guilty. So, a well-respected accountant is secretly embezzling from a charity. A politician who is infamous for voting against equal rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender citizens is himself having illicit sex with a man. A woman sees her wealthy neighbor slip and embarrassingly fall in public, and this woman finds herself hysterical with laughter. she cannot stop laughing to the mortification of immediately her husband and her son, and later to the mortification of herself. An educator secretly pillages his children's college fund to fuel a gambling addiction. A priest trusted to protect the least of these among us, taking advantage of innocent children. Our country spending billions on its military budget while slashing health, legal, and educational services to our most vulnerable citizens by cutting taxes on the wealthy. Or Jesus' example of love, mercy, and forgiveness metastasizing into the harsh persecutions of the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. These are only a few among many manifestations of the shadow. Those discrepancies between our professed values, our presumptive virtues, and our many embarrassing, often destructive habits. In popular culture, one of the most famous examples of the shadow manifesting itself are so-called Freudian slips, in which one's slip of the tongue potentially betrays more truth than you had consciously intended to say. Now, of course, there are times when the slip of the tongue is simply that, a verbal confusion and nothing more. Nothing more than a banana peel in the path of a sentence, accidental shifts in linguistic units. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Other times, there is a surplus of meaning that can be a clue into the unconscious. The trick is discerning which is which. So what are we to make of gaffes like Mayor Richard Daley saying, "The police aren't here to create disorder, they are here to preserve disorder"? Or Dan Quayle saying that Republicans understand the importance of bondage between a mother and her child. I believe he meant bonding, not bondage, right? Or George W. Bush saying, "I'd like to spank all teachers." I assume he meant think, not spank. Or Condoleezza Rice saying, "As I was telling my husband," I mean the President of the United States. I assume she didn't mean to refer to George Bush as her husband. Are these merely slips of the tongue, or are they examples of the unconscious surreptitiously exposing a glimpse of itself? So if you find yourself on the other side of having made or witnessed a Freudian slip, that's an invitation to reflect. Is there any deeper truth here? But since Freudian slips by definition are accidental slips of the tongue, they cannot be planned in advance. In contrast to the most reliable and helpful sources of shadow material that I've found are repeated patterns and exaggerated reactions. I'll say more about both of those. If you look back and see this repeated negative pattern in your life, perhaps something that's sort of almost like a different sport, all the other things in your life that are kind of negative are kind of bad, and there's this other thing that's like really bad, what's that about? What's underneath that? What is your earliest memory of that pattern? What might be currently unconscious in your shadow that might potentially become more conscious as you begin to think, how is this reflected in my family systems, my systems of origin, some of my earliest memories? How might that becoming more conscious of that pattern slowly give you a greater chance of breaking the strength of that unconscious pattern that keeps replicating itself in your life? Relatedly, I should note that those negative patterns to look for, they're not only what you do, they're also what you avoid, things you avoid to the detriment of yourself and others. What is that about? What's that avoidance about? What's underneath it? A second reliable source of shadow material are exaggerated reactions. So a hypersensitive reaction to a person, to a situation that in retrospect seems all out of proportion to the situation at hand. So if a person or a situation triggers you, that's an invitation to ask yourself, what was that about? What is potentially being triggered in your unconscious that is augmenting your reaction? Are you just tired or hungry or stressed out? Are you what we sometimes joke in my family, you're hangry, you're hungry angry, you're angry because you're hungry? Or, for example, does the way a colleague reminds me perhaps of my sister cause me to overreact in a way that is really much more about my historically fraught relationship with my sister than anything this colleague said or did? It's just that she reminds me of my sister, so it's extra annoying to me. Now note, I'm an only child. This is a hypothetical example. It is not a passive-aggressive hint at anyone. The point is that a manifestation of one's unconscious shadow can warp relationships if we don't slow down and figure out what's really going on here. Becoming more conscious of what is currently unconscious. So if you're interested in an accessible introduction to shadow work, there's a really good chapter on shadow work if you just want kind of a few pages in Ken Wilber's book, Integral Life Practice. A good short book on this topic is James Hollis's Why Good People Do Bad Things. And if you're interested in going even deeper into shadow work, some classic ways of beginning to engage your shadow more fully are working with your dreams. So, recording your dreams, it helps to record them in first person. So, as if you're in them again. I'm in a room, suddenly I'm on a street. So record your dreams in first person. And then the best question I've found to ask is, what question is this dream inviting me to ask? There's a lot more to say about all that. But working with your dreams, journaling is a really great source. I was just thinking in my own life how, especially after the election, I've noticed that I wasn't exercising, I wasn't meditating for a few weeks, and I thought, well, maybe this is just, living in Trump's America. And then I actually looked back in my journal, and I saw, actually, it's a pattern that for about a few Novembers in a row, so it's actually more about, I think, the season. So journaling can be this powerful way of noting patterns over time. Also, of course, therapy is a great way of doing shadow work, having a third party there that can help with accountability, help with insight into things you may not have noticed. For now, I'll share with you just a few of the questions that James Hollis suggests as fruitful starting points for shadow work. The first is, can you imagine the opposite of your virtues? Can you see the ways that your strengths, those things that you're really good at that come easiest to you, are also clues into your weaknesses? To give you one common example, the virtue of selflessly caring for others can have the shadow of neglecting to care for yourself and then becoming resentful that those people that you selflessly care for that didn't ask you to do anything aren't replicating and reciprocating in a way that you have never articulated to them but are nonetheless resentful about. Conversely, someone with boundaries that are too rigid might be great at self-care, but putting up walls too high that maybe prevent them from connecting well with others or from people feeling like they can be close to them. So becoming more aware of your shadow is an invitation to more balance in your life. The second of the 5 questions, what are the key patterns in your relationships, especially avoidance, aggression, and repetition? How have these played out in your relationship with your parents, your siblings, your significant others, your children, and your coworkers, these same patterns of avoidance and aggression? Third, what annoys you the most about your partner or about others in general? Why that trait in particular? What's underneath that source of constant annoyance to you and other things you're fairly copacetic about? What's the shadow? What does it remind you of? Fourth, where do you repeatedly undermine yourself, create harmful replications producing the same old? Where do you flee from your best, riskiest self? Unless we become incrementally more conscious of the parts of ourselves that are currently unconscious, the default will always be unconsciously replicating the patterns that we have been repeating for decades. Finally, where do your parents still govern your life? Through repetition or through overcompensation? What messages from your childhood have you unconsciously internalized but never fully interrogated and articulated consciously, that are not, in saying, is this still serving me today? But until you interrogate that and consciously name it, there's a real power in naming it. These questions are not easy, but if you are feeling dissatisfied or stuck in your life, or if other people close to you are feeling dissatisfied and stuck with your life, shadow work can be a powerful source of liberation. I've sometimes literally felt a sort of energetic release when I've sort of had that aha moment around energy work. I've sometimes felt this real powerful release, almost like I've been repressing this thing, and all of a sudden the energy that had taken to repress that was suddenly unlocked. It can be really powerful. Before moving to my conclusion, I should be sure to mention that the shadow, the unconscious, manifests itself not only in our individual lives, but also institutionally and culturally. For instance, unreflective American exceptionalism, that we're just sort of across the board, the best country in the world who can do no wrong. That blocks us from seeing all the areas that we lag behind other countries and could actually learn from them. It can also block us from seeing the ways that our good intentions around the world often have tragic, unintended consequences. Unless we try, it is almost impossible to anticipate those unintended consequences hidden in the shadow. Likewise, we Unitarian Universalists have our own version of exceptionalism, in which we're tempted to think, oh, we've got everything figured out. That exceptionalism can have a shadow, among other things, that can make us quite difficult to partner with other people to do work in the world. Relatedly, technological progress, it's helped us feed increasing numbers of people, cure increasing numbers of diseases, and connect us globally in astounding ways. But among the many shadows of technology are the atomic bomb, potential to blow up the world, climate change with the growing threat daily of making the world eventually uninhabitable, and the ways that our technology is often made affordable through exploitative labor practices in the third world. The more I explore shadow work, the more I am suspicious of quick fixes, of easy promises, of simplistic certainty, because all of those approaches either willfully deny or are oblivious to the shadow side. Instead, I think James Hollis is on the right track, that the psychological and spiritual maturity of an individual, of a group, or even of a nation is found precisely in the capacity to tolerate ambiguity and ambivalence, and the anxiety generated by both. Looking to that greater complexity, for the next few days we will continue to be approaching and around winter solstice, but then the wheel of the year will begin turning in the opposite direction. The pendulum will begin swinging back, as it always does. And an invitation of shadow work is to see that when the dark days inevitably approach, that portends a time in which the light of resistance and resilience will grow stronger in response. We've seen some of that in Unitarian Universalist and other progressive religious congregations, that immediately after the election, which was perceived sort of much more so than just any other candidate winning from the opposite party, it's really had this surge of people attending, so that we saw people sort of reaching out for community and reaching out for that resistance and resilience. In that spirit, I'll close with this poem by Carrie Newcomer titled, On the Other Side of Solstice. The earth turns and we lean out to a gathering of ourselves, a little more light each day. Yes, it's true that shadow and light walk side by side, bowing their heads together in intimate conversation. Because the world turns, the darkest days must come, and the longest nights will spill across the floor like water. And yet, there will always be a subtle shift, a pivotal moment, when the darkest and deepest dark is done and the longest night is over. When we sense something luminous, something clear and unmistakable, the fulfillment of a promise growing stronger in regular and trustworthy implements. It will come. In that spirit, I invite you to rise in body or spirit. Let's sing together hymn 1015, I Know I Can.